Senator Hunt, you're recognized to open on your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. And to my friend, Senator Howard, I don't intend to return your bill to select. I just wanted to take a little bit of time here, and I'll be withdrawing this motion. Last night, Senator McAllister and his wife, Deb, very kindly invited me and several other senators to join them at Abraham's Tent, which is a celebration of the Tri-Faith Initiative, which is a campus in Omaha with a Muslim mosque, a Christian church, and a Jewish temple, all on the same campus together. And that's made up of congregations of these three Abrahamic faiths, and they're all committed to practicing respect and acceptance and trust with each other. This is the first undertaking of its kind in the country, and I believe in the world. And I just had a really great time last night with Senator Lathrop and Senator DeBoer, Senator Kavanaugh, Senator Pansing-Brooks, and many of our friends in celebrating the mission of acceptance and respect with these people of all different faiths. I was so dismayed, and not surprised, but very dismayed by the news of another heartbreaking synagogue shooting on Saturday, especially on the last day of Passover. My colleagues know I have not made a secret of the fact that I'm not a person of faith, but of course I believe in the right to worship in peace and safety, and that that right belongs to everybody, and that right was disturbed again this weekend. Our Muslim brothers and sisters were attacked in New Zealand at a mosque during Friday prayer. Our Catholic brothers and sisters were attacked in Sri Lanka at Easter Mass. Our Jewish brothers and sisters were attacked in San Diego at a synagogue on Passover. So this continues to be a problem. This is not a problem just facing underrepresented groups. This is facing all of us. And as people in a position of power, we have got to decide what we're going to do about that. The rise of white nationalism and white supremacy in the United States is a reminder of how far we have to be willing to go in the struggle for freedom, and a reminder that nobody has an excuse to stay silent. There are people living today for whom life under fascism was a reality. Many of those people are refugees, who are immigrants, who are people who faced persecution in their home countries, who are trying to come here for a better life. But a lot of these people are also Americans who suffer today under the fascism of neo-Nazism and white supremacy, people who are followed out of their mosques by people carrying guns, people who fear going to temple because of the threat of gun violence that just continues to grow. It continues to become more realistic. People who are targeted because of the color of their skin or because of the faith that they practice. White supremacist terror attacks are the leading terror attacks in the United States, but the men who commit these atrocities are not monitored, they're not taken seriously by the FBI until it's too late. Poway Synagogue, white supremacist. Christ Church Mosque, white supremacist. Tree of Life Synagogue, white supremacist. Mother Emanuel AME Church, white supremacist. Oak Creek Sikh Temple, white supremacist. Islamic Center of Quebec City, white supremacist. All of these murders committed with assault-style rifles. There are also hate groups in Nebraska that we need to be aware of as a body, as a legislative body. These are recognized by the Southern Poverty Law Center. ACOC, which is racist skinheads, Great Millstone, Proud Boys, the Daily Stormer, Third Reich Books, National Socialist German Workers' Party, Global Faith Institute, Mission to Israel. These are all hate groups that are recognized by the Southern Poverty Law Center that we need to know about in our own state here in Nebraska. Our nation's epidemic of white supremacy and gun violence is killing people. It's killing people. And people in positions of power need to agree on that, and we need to decide collectively what we're going to do, not through, doing a little game with our motions and standing up on the mic and saying something about it, but what are we going to do through policy changes to combat that? From the city council level to the school board level to state legislatures to Congress, legislators have got to see themselves. We have to stop seeing ourselves as separate from the problem and decide what we're going to do collectively about it, because activists alone can't solve this. People, doing the best to support the people in their own communities can't solve this alone. Good guys with a gun can't solve this. Vigilantes can't solve this. A wholesale cultural shift needs to occur, including a firm and vocal, bright line drawn rejecting white supremacy. The victims of these shootings, these hate crimes, are reminders of our violent history in the United States, and we are witnesses today to our violent present in the United States. We are witnesses, but we cannot also be bystanders. As Americans, those of you who are people of faith, elected officials, people who just want to be good people, we need to show courage whenever freedom is in danger, because eventually the time comes to act, and you're living in it now. This is the time to act. So please decide what you're going to do about protecting liberty and justice for all, and then do a little bit more. It's like training for a marathon. You're out of breath, you think you can't work anymore, and in these times, you have to push yourself a little bit harder. We all need to go through some conditioning, and we all need to be a little bit stronger and have more courage in speaking out against this. We are a nation in perpetual grief. We are a nation that needs to reckon with its future. All Nebraskans can agree, all Americans can agree that gun violence needs to stop, and thoughts and prayers are not enough. And I stand, and I hope my colleagues stand with me, with victims and survivors, and against the gun lobby and the NRA determining policy in Nebraska by putting their thumb on the scale. This is not a partisan thing. This cannot be a both sides thing. Many sides are not responsible for the violence, hate, and tragic deaths that are on the rise in this country. We need leaders to stand against the gun lobby and not only condemn, but take actions against this rise in hateful, targeted violence. Institutionalized white supremacy does not care about your intentions. It doesn't care if you mean well. It doesn't care what you hold in your heart. If you have animosity for people, if you have racism in your soul, if you have prejudice against people of other faiths, all white supremacy sees is participation in these systems and complicity in these systems. And I want you all to think about how and if you have been a passive participant in these systems, how you can unlearn your biases that you've learned throughout your life, a lot of which you might not be responsible for learning, but you are responsible for unlearning. Look at what is driving religious hatred in this country. Question whether your votes here contribute to that. Question whether you've done enough to speak out about it. Not in your heart, not in your mind, not in your prayers before bedtime, but out loud when it counts. So I invite you to stand up and speak out against injustices, against these forces that divide us, that don't unite us. We say that we're a culture that protects our children, we're a culture that protects life, but when we fail to protect people from violence, from the effects of trauma, from media personalities who prey on these tragedies for ratings, we're failing to stand up for life. We're standing to stand up for what's right. 70% of all Americans agree that we need stronger gun safety laws. This does not have to be a partisan issue, and we need to take some common sense steps toward that end. I've been very preoccupied with this weekend with some personal things in my life that I'm struggling with, and preparing for a lot of bills that are coming up with this week, plus minding my own business about the job that I have to keep on the side in order to do this work. But I'll be bringing a legislative resolution against white supremacy, similar to the one that was passed by both the House of Representatives and the US Senate. And that's something that I hope all of you will consider signing on to say that in the meantime, while we work on policy that addresses this in meaningful ways, we can do something symbolic as a state to say to these victims that we stand in solidarity with you, that we see you, that your lives matter, and that we are committed as a body to protecting you. Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor.
Thanks, Senator Hunt. Senator Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. First, I'd like to wish happy birthday to our colleague, Senator McAllister. I hope you are having a wonderful day so far. And to that end, let's talk about systemic racism. You're welcome. That's my birthday present to you. I too was at Abraham's tent last evening, and it was an extremely moving event. And the gentleman who spoke spoke so heartfelt about what it meant to grow up as a Muslim man in America. And he's a little bit younger than me. I was out of college when September 11th, 2001 happened, and he was still in college. And he said that there's before September 11th and after September 11th. And so many people in this chamber, in the world, have that defining moment in their lives. And September 11th was a defining moment in my life. My sister lived in New York at the time. I had been living with her over the summer. I had just graduated from college. I left New York on September 7th, 2001. And it was only a few days later. I had come back to Omaha before I was going to settle in Washington, D.C., and cell phones didn't work. And I couldn't reach my sister. Nobody could reach my sister. And we didn't know where she was. We didn't know if she was in Manhattan that day or if she was in Brooklyn. And it was terrifying. And then we found out that my uncles, who are airline pilots, were flying. And my uncle Billy Barrett, was supposed to be flying. He always flew the Boston flight. That was his flight. And we didn't know for a very long time that he did not have that flight that day. We were so blessed, so lucky that he was in Denver instead. My Uncle John was flying back from France, I believe, and he is one of the planes that had to land in Canada, and they had to stay in a church for about a week, I think. And my Uncle John had to clean the plane entirely by himself because they wouldn't allow anyone on there except for the captain. And we also didn't know where he was for a long time. So it was a terrifying day for my family. But it didn't change anything for us as far as caring about people of other faith backgrounds. We never thought that September 11th meant that Muslims were evil. We never thought that September 11th meant that we didn't have the same God as those of the Muslim faith. And so it's been disheartening to see our Muslim brothers and sisters treated the way that they've been treated in this country, because they are also Americans. They love this country just as everyone else does. This is their home. Last night, the speaker talked about immigration and restricting immigration numbers. And in the 1920s, we tried to restrict immigration from Ireland. My family came to America in the late 19-teens from Ireland. They were fleeing persecution. My great-grandfather and great-grandmother got on a ship in the middle of the night. They got married right before they got on the ship because Anne Conroy was not going to go on a ship with a gentleman she was not married to.
1 minute.
Thank you. And they came to the U.S., and they were put on a train to Omaha, Nebraska. They bought a house on 39th and R Street in Omaha, and they raised their family there. And their daughter and 2 sons raised their families there. Next door to each other, my great uncle Jimmy Munley, he bought the lot next to the house, and he raised his family there. And my grandmother and grandfather raised their family in my grandmother's childhood home. And it was, my grandma used to tell us about South Omaha, SOB. My dad's a South Omaha boy. He's an SOB. And in South Omaha, every church is a different ethnic saint attached to it, because that's where all the immigrants ended up, and they all started their own churches, but they're all Catholic churches. So you got St. Mary's as the Irish church. And it's a wonderful tribute to how we can cohabitate. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator Marfeld.
Thank you, Mr. President and colleagues. I also rise in support of LB 556, Senator Howard's bill, but I do want to take the time to talk about some substantive action and steps that can be taken in light of Senator Hunt's comments today about white supremacy and gun violence. I introduced LB 58, which is the Extreme Risk Protection Order Act, which would make it so that a court who finds that a person who poses a significant risk to themselves or others can temporarily take away their firearms for up to a year. And the debate is, well, I shouldn't say the debate. It was a committee hearing. We obviously aren't going to have debate on that bill this year. But the committee hearing was interesting in that the opposition brought up, well, this is a violation of their due process rights. And Senator Moorfeld, you should spend more time on things like making sure that people have medical care and services and access to mental health treatment. So a few things in response to that. Yes, we should make sure that we have access to health care and mental health services. But it's not mutually exclusive to the fact that we need to take other actions. It's interesting to me that the same people that come in opposition to reasonable restrictions on firearms, particularly for people who pose a serious threat to their own life and particularly to other lives, that it's met with immediate opposition and a bunch of folks who say we should care more about mental health services, yet are completely silent when we have bills that would allow for mental health services. They fail to go to those hearings. And I watch some of those hearings, and I look at the proponents and the opponents on the committee statement when those bills come out. And yet it is silence when it comes to actually taking action to provide those mental health services by those same people that oppose reasonable restrictions on gun rights of people who clearly pose a danger to themselves and others. The people best positioned to understand how important these red flag laws are, law enforcement, came in and testified. I think I had 2 or 3 different law enforcement officers or representatives of law enforcement agencies that came in and talked about how incredibly important these types of laws were in order to ensure public safety. Reasonable laws that require due process. And a lot of folks said, well, hey, listen, I would love this bill, but it just doesn't have due process. One, it does. It requires a court hearing shortly after the temporary emergency order is given by a court, after hearing evidence from law enforcement and other individuals. But it seems to be that these folks want you to commit the crime first before doing anything about the dangerous firearms that are killing literally thousands of people in our country every year. They want them to commit the crime first, even though law enforcement and all kinds of other people have come out and said before these shootings even took place that this person is going to do something horrible, they're going to do something bad. But yet we have no tools for law enforcement and the courts to protect our communities and our society because of false arguments about due process and distractions about the need to look into mental health care. We can look into mental health care. I don't see any of those same people coming and testify in opposition to my bill, testifying in support of Medicaid expansion. And I pay attention to testifies in support of Medicaid expansion. None of them were there. Medicaid expansion would actually make it so that about 90,000 Nebraskans would have access to mental health supports, medication, and other needs. We can take action on this. First, by, yes, standing up against white supremacy, but second, and most importantly, by actually taking substantive action. Substantive action that takes dangerous firearms away from people who we know pose a significant risk, who have to go before a court and testify and show evidence that they pose a significant risk. We can do it by actually making it so that people have health care and not just talking about it. There is all kinds of action that we can take, but we fail to do it. And yet, after each of these tragedies, we all get up and go, oh, wow, gosh, that's horrible. I'll pray for you. It rings hollow. It rings hollow to me, to the victims who will never have a voice, to the families, and then to an entire world that knows that there are common sense solutions that we can take action on to prevent gun violence, to go after white supremacy, and to ensure that people have the community support so they never even get to that point.
That's time, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thanks, Senator Moorfeld. Senator Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the legislature. When these types of motions are offered, the field is open to discuss anything and everything. Senator Hunt gave a good direction for the discussion not to limit it, but to focus it. I'm going to focus on what has been happening to black people ever since we've been in this country. You all talk about immigration and how immigrants are mistreated, and everything you say is true. See, I'm black. Were I blacker, I could be prouder. We are the only people who were forced against our will to come to this country. We did not come here as immigrants. We came here as captives. 6 million Jews were killed in Germany by the Germans, in Poland, in other countries. They had the death camps. Millions of black people died on what was called the Middle Passage, thrown into the ocean, treated inhumanely, and that continues to this day. You all need to think sometimes about who you've got in your midst. I graduated from grade school, all white teachers, high school at Tech, all white teachers, Creighton University, all white teachers, Creighton Law School, all white teachers, graduated from all of them. Everything I studied pertained to white people from the white people's perspective. When I make negative comments about that flag and refer to it as a rag, you get more upset about the comment than you do about the factors that lead me to make that statement, and you'll never come face to face with them and never address them. I don't like the pledge because it is a lie every time you tell it, every time you say it. You talk about one nation under God, indivisible. Where is the under God? Muslims have been attacked, Jews have been attacked, and it's for religion. Where's the under God? This country has never been as divided as it is now, and you all stand up to that piece of fabric and tell that lie every day, one nation indivisible, and this country is fractured. You don't think about what you say, but I think about it. White people have everything their way. They don't have to think about anything. The handout I gave you today, me being arrested on a false charge. I was wearing a relatively tight t-shirt, and I was charged with carrying a concealed weapon. Where could I conceal it? And the charges were dismissed, but in the meantime, the aggravation, the inconvenience, they thought it would embarrass me in front of my community, but black people knew how I stood for us, and they knew that the police were our enemy. So when our enemy attacked me in that fashion, that showed the impact that I must be having in our behalf. And I never backed off. There's another small article attached, and it says another charge against Senator Chambers, or whatever the term was they used, had to be dismissed. Another means that there were others, and there were others. I have an extensive arrest record. When I was a barber, there was a fish seller next to the shop. Cops would park in the bus stone, go in and get fish. So I was standing on the step looking at this cop, and he arrested me and charged me with disturbing the peace. And when I went to court, he could not explain how I was disturbing the peace other than to say that when I looked at him, I disturbed his peace. That's what a white cop can do to a black man. And you all wonder why I'm upset? It doesn't happen to you. What I get upset about is the fact that you don't believe it, but I'm not surprised. But you're not going to silence me, and I'm going to bring it up and bring it up and bring it up.
That's time, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thanks, Senator Chambers. Senator Howard.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wasn't planning on talking today, although I appreciate a robust debate. not at all related to my bill. So 556, just a reminder, this is the A bill for the prescription drug monitoring program bill, and it's all federal funds. But I actually was really grateful that Senator Hunt stood up and talked about the synagogue shooting this weekend, because I do think that there's more that we can do as a body to recognize that there is bias and discrimination occurring in our country and in our state. And one of the proposals that I brought forth this year was LB 640, which is a bill that requires Holocaust and genocide education for students. It's currently in the Education Committee. It didn't have a priority, and so the committee really hasn't had time to discuss it. But the bill came about because I went on a trip to Washington and was meeting with an individual who works at Representative Bacon's office. And he said that of all of the things that are required in our educational system, the Holocaust is not one of them. And I couldn't believe it. And then when we dug a little bit deeper, we found out that about 2/3 of young American adults couldn't identify what Auschwitz was, which was incredible. I feel like the Holocaust is it's a vital part of human history, and it outlines how dangerous dehumanization can be. But it also, when we don't recognize the Holocaust and when we don't recognize this as part of our educational system, we also sort of forget the veterans who fought so bravely to end the Nazi regime in Germany and in Europe. And we actually had a veteran come to the hearing and talk about how important he felt as though this type of education within our educational programming should be, because they fought so hard. When we think about what is happening right now with repeated shootings at synagogues, so often we think that anti-Semitism is dead and it doesn't exist anymore. But these are very stark reminders that it continues to exist in our country and beyond. 640 is a great bill. I hope the Education Committee will have some time to discuss it. But it's also my hope that by moving this bill along and by educating our youth about the past, we can prevent these events from happening in the future. Now, I'm talking about the Holocaust, but the bill also touches on genocide, which is something that it is horrific. The Holocaust and genocides together, we had originally listed different genocides, so Rwanda and Native American, and we ended up removing them so that the crime of genocide or genocides in history would be included as a whole. When I was in college, I had a work study job. I was desperate to not do my work study job that was washing dishes, and so I started seeking out professors that I could work for instead of washing dishes. And the first two professors that caught me were two professors who were noted sort of Africanist scholars, and they gave me sheets of paper. They gave me a box with sort of very thin paper, and they said, we want you to take these lists of names and put them into a spreadsheet for us so that we can search them. And at the end of the project, I had done just piles and piles of boxes with very thin paper. At the end of the project, I asked them what the names were. And they were the names of individuals who had been murdered in the second Rwandan genocide. And I had just spent an entire year cataloging those names. It was overwhelming and terrifying to think about. And so if I may just for a moment put a plug in for LB 640, while we discuss LB 556 to the Education Committee. I hope you will consider passing this bill out. Senator Slama and Senator LaGrone have graciously signed on to it. And so with that, please pass LB 556A. It's actually really important to me as well. So thank you, Mr. President.
Thanks, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator Pansy Brooks. I'm sorry, Senator Kavanaugh, you're next in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Howard, for reminding us about this very important bill, LB 556. I think it brings to mind the importance of what Senator Hunt was talking about and what Senator Chambers was talking about. These things are all interconnected. Addiction is a real issue in this country. Racism is a real issue in this country. And oftentimes these two things can be tied, not racism broadly, but racism in the case of the shooting that happened can be tied to behavioral health. And having it at the forefront of our minds that the opioid epidemic is real and we need to be facing head-on the challenges that those suffering from behavioral health have every single day. I appreciate Senator Howard. She's made her work and her mother's work has made Nebraska one of the most progressive states in fighting the opioid epidemic. But we still have a lot to do as far as changing the perspective on addiction and changing the perspective on behavioral health. Whenever there's a mass shooting or any kind of shooting, it does bring to mind the behavioral health element. What brings some person to think that it's okay to kill another person because of a belief system? And we as a country need to be working harder, and we as a state and a legislative body need to be working harder to be thoughtful in our rhetoric and how we talk about individuals that are different from ourselves. Senator Chambers brought up a very important point that my family, our family of immigrants, but though they were fleeing things in their home countries, they were not forced to come here. And Senator Chambers' family did not come here of their own volition. And that is a tragedy that is still and will always be a mark on this country's history. Just as it is a tragedy and a mark on this country's history that we massacred those that were here before us, that we massacred our Native American brothers and sisters. And those things are stuck in when I talk about systemic racism, that's what really where it starts is our history, and you have to look at our history. The entire creation of law enforcement in this country was based around when we no longer had slaves, but they started to become free, and so we needed a new way to enslave those that were previously enslaved, and that's how we started our incarceration system. Our prison system is riddled with a history of racism, and we need to be looking at that through our public policy and how we can do more to reduce our prison population through more thoughtful legislation, what we can do to make sure that our prison system isn't reflective of a broken system of racism. And there are things we can be doing. We can be looking at what crimes are considered a felony. We can be looking at who's convicted of a felony and who's kicked down to a misdemeanor. And the data is there. If you have a white man who's 25 and a black man who's 25 and they commit the exact same crime and it could be a misdemeanor, 9 times out of 10, that white man's going to get a misdemeanor, and 9 times out of 10, that black man's going to get a felony. And that's a problem. And actually, that's just math in my head. I don't know. I'm probably way more skewed than that. So it's important that we keep this topic, and I so appreciate Senator Hunt bringing to the floor today this tragedy that has befallen our country yet again, and the hate that is in people's hearts. We need to be the change. We as a body have the opportunity to change people's hearts and minds by the thoughtful legislation that we put forward today and in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator Hunt, you're recognized.
I'd just like to withdraw the motion. Thank you.
Motion's withdrawn.